So if you were here last night, you know that I lost my voice about 5 minutes before walking up on stage, and it's kind of coming back, but there's a good chance we're going to lose it again. So I don't know what you thought this message was going to be when you came in here, and honestly, I don't really know where it's going to go either. So we're just going to kind of like process it together. A little bit of my background might be similar to some of your backgrounds. I was raised in a very, very conservative church, and how they handled issues that people went through was to give a motivating speech. And I don't like that approach. So I hope that you are not motivated at all when you walk outside. I told my friend a couple weeks ago when I told him about this, I probably should have phrased this better, but I said, I hope no one leaves encouraged when they walk out the door. But maybe that's not the right word. I would rather you leave reflective on your own soul and on your own heart and where you're at. So that's my hope for you. There's kind of two things that this whole thing is maybe going to be centered around. We don't know. Things come out of my mouth, and then that's what happens. One, you're talking a lot about conflict in this whole conference. That's what the whole conference is about. But I think that conflict with any other relationship is not going to work as you continue to struggle with self-conflict. The second thing is that conflict is not a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, and I think that maybe we've assumed that it's become a bad thing. Conflict is just two people with two different ideas on how to perceive the world coming together and butting heads. And I couldn't even think of a positive word besides butting heads. It has such a negative connotation, and it doesn't have to be. I conflict with my friends all the time on things in my family, but I'm so thankful for that conflict because it's healthy, because we see the other person, and you want the other person to be better by the end of that conversation, and I think that's how we should approach conflict. So in the first session, I kind of realized people had a lot of questions about empathy and vulnerability. So I want to kind of frame this session a little more with that in terms of conflict. But first, I've kind of workshopped this talk with a couple people I've sat down with, a handful of people, and kind of told them what I wanted to talk about. And what was really interesting was when I said the word society, everyone has come up with a different view of society. Some people I sat down with when I said society, what issues in society do you see? They said consumerism. Consumerism is such a problem, and we need to fix it, and society is so bad at it. And then other people said beauty. Beauty is, society is the wreck of everything that we know is beautiful. Or some people said gender roles, they're destroying us, or whatever it is. Everyone's was different. And I was wow, that's so interesting that everyone has a different role or view of society. But what was more interesting is when I said society, people said the thing that they struggle with the most. So we each kind of view society through this lens of our deepest wounds are society's biggest stories. So society is so specific to how we frame our world because it's so personalized to the things we're going through. So there's two kind of wounds, I guess, that can happen in a person, and I'm going to share with you my two wounds. The first being I was born with a cleft palate, and for those of you who do not know what that is, I was basically born without an upper lip and this part of my nose. So it's kind of unsightly for a child. I've had surgeries on it, and most people would tell you that they wouldn't even be able to tell that I had a cleft unless I told you. But the thing about it is as soon as I tell you about the scar, you'll always notice that it's there, as my face doesn't really set that straight. So as a kid, I was sitting in McDonald's when I was probably 7 or 8, and this little girl came up to me, that little girl, and she came up and she just asked hey, what's wrong with your face? And I'm thinking where is your mom? Who raised you to ask people questions like this? I'm kind of like a grumpy old man as a 7-year-old, so. And so I explained the story that I got it because I was born with a cleft. Oh, what's that? I don't know. I just wasn't born with a face. They usually like shut them up and then they went to the play place or something. But to continue explaining that over and over and over for the whole course of my life, like what's wrong with your face? It was so vulnerable, but I didn't even know what that was being a 7-year-old. Also, I need to point out the fact that everything I say sounds much more dramatic than I intend because my voice doesn't work. But it kind of works in my benefit because it sounds like I'm being really sincere. But I am kind of sincere. So I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, and I always attributed it to the fact that it must be because I look different, I look weird. I don't know what else would explain it, because I feel like I have a decently okay personality for being 12. I looked at the catalog of the other 12-year-olds out there, and I felt like I was okay. Yeah, I was awkward, I was weird, couldn't spell worth anything, but I felt like, in hindsight, things are okay. So I had to blame it on something physical, because it had to be something physical. So I blamed it on the fact that my face will never be straight. And I got to 16, and I was adopted, and I started kind of peeling back the layers of my adoption. And I learned that my adoption agency that I went through in Ohio, when I was born, they called a family and they said, hey, we have a baby for you. And at the time, little context, Ohio in 1991 did not fix cleft palates, just automatically the family would have to pay for it. And they called the first family and they said, hey, we have a baby for you, but just to warn you, she has a cleft palate, so you're gonna have to fix that. And they said no. So they called the second family on the list and they said, hey, we have a baby for you, congratulations. When do you wanna come pick it up? But we have to warn you, that she was born with a cleft palate, so you're gonna have to fix that, medically. It's fixable, but you're gonna have to pay for that. And they also said no. So they called the third family on the list, Mick and Nancy Hartung. And I think you probably know where the story's going because they announced my last name already. And my parents were packing for their trip to Florida, their annual trip to Florida. And they get a phone call, and the adoption agency says, hey, we have a baby for you. And my mom just cut him off, and she said, she's mine. And then he said, well, wait a second, we need to tell you some other families have turned. And she said, no, you don't need it, she's ours. I don't care, just can we come pick her up? And can she go on our family vacation with us? So they picked me up at the adoption agency, and we drove to Florida. And I learned in that moment that I fell in love with my scar, because my scar had this really important story that just, to that little girl in McDonald's, whoever she is, I should probably talk that out with my therapist. That's a story that she wouldn't know if the scar didn't exist. I was talking the last session about kind of this external scar that people were hey, well, you have an external scar, people can ask you about it. How would you get there? But I have a lot of internal scars too. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression when I was about in 6th grade. And it was so weird that a 6th grader was diagnosed with anxiety that they just wrote it off as acid reflux, because a 6th grader shouldn't be that stressed out. But as I got older, I kind of lived with this taboo of anxiety and depression, and it was this wound on my heart that hadn't scarred yet. And I went to high school, and it hurt because people didn't know what to do with it. And I didn't know what to do with it. And I got to college, and I finally found a sense of healing. And that wound of anxiety and depression, it became a scar, and it became a story that I could tell. And then I realized, our scars tell a story, whether they're internal or external. And I want to make it really, really clear that whether your scars are internal or external, there's a story, and it's your story, and it's incredibly important. And how that ties into this realm of society is I told my friend earlier that I'd probably botch all of these sociology terms because I'm not a sociology major. So I'm just going to make up what my view of society is. I think society is a collection of our stories. It's a collection of our scars. Society reflects the things that we see in ourselves because we are society. That's like the weird thing about society and culture. It's like culture influences us, but we influence culture. Like, what are we supposed to do with that paradigm? But I hope that empowers you to say, like, oh, I actually have a voice because I'm a person, and that's all I need. I'm here, and I matter, and I have an influence in society. My fear is that society has become overshadowed with wounds instead of the stories of our scars. And that is why we feel so much pressure from society about the way that we look, the way that we perceive others, the way that we view business or churches or anything. Whatever word comes to mind when I say society and you think like, this is what's wrong in society, that thing is deeply related to you and I's stories. Sorry, I probably shouldn't cough into the mic. I study communication. And there's this theory, if you bear with me, because I'm about to throw words at you. But if you're like me, you need like 10-year-old definitions, because when people word things too complicated, I don't understand. So I tried to write this as if I was talking to myself as a 10-year-old. There's a theory called the narrative paradigm. And it's Walter Fisher, and it essentially says that we are storytellers by nature. That's how our society works. That's how we work as a culture, is we exist on stories. And in this paradigm, we have the narrative fidelity, which essentially states, and I'll read it because I'm going to botch it if I try to make it up. Narrative fidelity states that if a story matches our own beliefs and experiences, we will accept it. And when I read that, I realized, like, oh, that's why we're accepting all these messages from society, whatever that is, from media, from whoever's bigger than us, because we actually believe it ourselves. So to rip off a line from Perks of Being a Wallflower, essentially, we accept the messages we think we deserve. Thank you for, like, the kind of pity laughs. I didn't make that up. I wish I did, though, because that's really deep stuff. Sorry, I got distracted by my hand in the shadow. That's weird. Wow. It's that Dayquil, guys. I kept thinking, like, so what do we do with our stories, you know? Like, if we want to, like, move forward in society, like, what does that look like? So I was talking to my friend a couple weeks ago, and he's an atheist, agnostic man, great guy. And he's like focused a lot on consumerism. And I asked him, like, he was like against like all these big churches, and they were just like taking money, and he had like a lot of proper claims, like a lot of things that were very true. And so I kind of kept digging deeper into that. And I said, like, what do you think you do to change it? And he's like, it's got to be something big, like an overturn of the government, like something huge. And I was like, you don't think you could just start with a person and then tell another person their story, and then you tell another person their story, and then that's how you start seeing social change? He said, like, no, that's too small. He said, I think you have to have something really big, and then you can have something small, like working aside, like with it. But you have to have like something huge happen. And as we were like progressing in the conversation, I realized the difference between him and I was I have the big thing that happened because I have Jesus. So the big thing happened a long time ago, and now the little thing is supposed to happen for it to continue. That's like where our stories come into place. So he's still waiting on a big social change to happen, and he's going to be looking in all the wrong place because the biggest social change that ever happened already came, and now we continue it on. Thanks, Amanda. It's my friend, everyone. I have friends, surprisingly. So I was kind of thinking, like, how do you move forward? Like, how do you put a title on like who we're supposed to be with our stories? And at first I was like, someone said it last night, and it's a very well put term, like culture makers. And like, that's cool and exciting. But then I thought, like, again, 10-year-old definition, that's like too artsy for me. So then I thought, like, change agents, because I'm like really into crime and like FBI stuff. And I was like, I like that a lot. But that sounds like really uppity. So let's not go with that one. And then I was like, maybe we should go like on the spiritual side, like rescued rescuers, because that sounds like a children's program on like a Bible network. And I thought that was really fun. But then I thought, like, maybe we're missing some people. So then I just kind of went back to this narrative paradigm, and I think we should just be storytellers. I think that's how we start to see social change. I wrote something, I should have actually turned to it before I stood up here, but I didn't. There it is, found it. On my little diagram of what I was going to talk about tonight, and I haven't used it one time. Society changes when we settle self-conflict. The story of society is a story of us. There's this quote that I love from Frederick Buechner's Telling Secrets. I read it this past summer, and if you ever get a chance to read it, do that. He says, this is one of those things like I wish I would have written, so I'm envious of this quote, and then also inspired by this quote, but more just jealous that he wrote it 30 years before I was born, so I couldn't write it. My story is important, not because it's mine, God knows, but because if I tell it anything right, the chances are you will recognize that in many ways it is also yours. It is precisely that through these stories, in all their uniqueness, as I have long believed and often said, that God makes himself known to each of us more powerfully and personally. If this is true, it means that to lose track of our stories is to be profoundly impoverished, not only humanly, but also spiritually. It's a good quote, right? And I've been studying connection, as I said last night, for the past year and a half, and then like humor with that. And if you were here last night, and if you weren't here last night, I should stop referring to you as if you're all here, because you probably weren't. Connection is a fancy word for how we see and relate to other people. And I would challenge that our stories is where we start with that. So if you want to learn to be an empathetic person, learn to be a vulnerable person. Learn to settle that conflict. Sorry that I'm using the word conflict a lot. It's a part of the conference. They require it to be used 20 times. That's not true. To settle the conflict inside yourself, so that you're confident in the story that you've been given, whatever that is, whether you think it's a good story or bad story or mediocre story, and you're thinking like, I didn't struggle with anxiety, so like, whatever, I don't care. Your story is just as important as the person next to you. And then when you see somebody, because you're so confident in who has written your story, then you realize that their story is just as important as yours. And so then we move from empathy to humility. I feel like I had another quote, but apparently I don't, so I'm going to go with this one. If you want to see what you look like, look at who you're spending time with. I think our community shapes some of our stories, and sometimes that's really good and sometimes it's really bad, but either way is really important. I'm like incredibly lucky to, after 21 years of life, to have finally found some really incredible people who challenge me and are willing to grow with me through good stuff, bad stuff, all the stuff in between. But it was like a long process to get there. And I've noticed within my friendships that like why it works and sometimes why it doesn't is if we're willing to take the responsibility to heal those wounds in our heart. Someone asked me in the last session, like, what do we do with these wounds? Like the internal wounds, how do we engage those? How do we address those? And I think you have to admit it. I think you have to validate those things in your heart that you don't want to validate, because you need validation. You need someone to tell you that those things are real, that those things are painful, that the things you went through are incredibly important. because they shape exactly the story that you have. I think the greatest way that we can battle self-conflict is to give society some new stories. My friend, I think she wrote something a couple years ago that said to be honest with all, vulnerable with a few. Because I think there is some limitations to vulnerability, because we are human and we are limited. My philosophy teacher said like 2 weeks ago, to love your neighbor, and we kind of assume that's everybody. But loving your neighbor is just loving the people that you have in contact with. So start there. And I promise a social change will happen when we start telling our stories. And you don't have to stand up here and like talk at Torrey conference to tell your story. If you know a person, they have a story and you have a story. So let's call it like story time or something. And we'll work on a better title because I realize that's cheesy. But if you engage in one another's story, I promise you'll find humility, and you'll find empathy, and you'll find vulnerability. So if anyone has any questions, thoughts, comments about anything, I would love to chat about it with you. So if there's any brave souls, go right ahead.
Perfect. So you said the quote, "Be honest with all, vulnerable with you." How do you find that you like select, but not to sound like selective, but like how do you choose those people to be vulnerable with versus just the people to be honest with?
I think it takes a lot of mistakes to find those people. Unfortunately, that is the best method that I have found. Find enough people to not be vulnerable with, and somewhere in between you will find some. And I think you have to like learn to start setting boundaries for yourself of how often you share with a wide group of people, and maybe kind of like gauging what they're going through at the same time. If a friend of mine who struggles with anxiety is like in a bad place and I'm struggling with it too, maybe it's best that I don't talk to him, not talk to him, but like talk to him about that specific issue and go to another friend who's a little bit more sane at that time. So I think that there's a responsibility in vulnerability, and I would hate that we interpret vulnerability as something that we just put on other people. Vulnerability is our story, not someone else's. So also being willing to be told no at that time. You know, like, hey, I'm going through something, I really can't work through this with you. I think that's really admirable and respectful. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, I'm sorry.
If empathy is really related to how you communicate your story to other people, what does empathy look like with strangers or acquaintances or people that you meet more randomly?
Mm-hmm. Someone shared in the last session, kind of those like internal things, like mine would be like anxiety, depression. A stranger wouldn't know where that's coming from unless you did some research about it on me, I guess. And I think empathy allows us to see people, because there's like this connection, and maybe I feel like we all have this. This is an overstatement and not biblically backed, so this is a personal opinion. That like when you go through something and you're super honest about it, and you see somebody and you're like, I know that feeling. Like, I know what you're going through, and I've never been met you before. I think that's something really, really cool that happens. And I think as you continue to like kind of jump into the security of your own story, I think I think that, like, what word am I looking for? Action develops, I guess. But I think the more empathetic we become, just the like more easygoing we are about things. We don't judge people as fast based off of our own stereotypes of a people group. I guess in kind of relation to what we talked to a little bit about last night, empathy sees another person, and not just like sees them and like walks away from them, but sees them and has compassion with them and then engages in their story. So when you see a stranger, sometimes like you only see them for a few seconds in a day, or like maybe you don't even talk with them, but like we still have contact with them. So what kind of contact are we making with them? I guess that's something we could all do a little bit better in. That even if you see someone for a split second, is that like a split second that you can change their world through like your just natural ability to be empathetic? Again, I hope that answers your question.
How did you get to the place where you embraced your scars and like started wanting to be healed?
So I totally forgot a story earlier, so that would be helpful to probably share. I was sitting in the garage so this is kind of related to my cliff palette. I was sitting in the garage of a friend last year. He's a good-looking guy, and I kind of thought like, oh, if I was like good-looking, then I wouldn't have all the problems that I would have. And I never really verbalized that to anyone because that's still like a very like touchy subject to talk about with people. And I sat down and we like talked for a while, and he just said like, man, sometimes I just wish I had like a scar across my face so that people would like judge me on my like worth as a person and not because I look good in their Instagrams. And then I think that's when my world flipped a little bit, because it's like grass is always greener. The very thing that I wanted that I thought would satisfy me was someone's biggest struggle, which then taught me like empathy alongside that. So to embrace my scar, it took me learning the story of someone else, someone like so specifically that wanted the exact, or like had the exact same like situation, but in polar opposite scenarios. That was definitely a big change for my perception on this.
Like, how did having a relationship with God, how has it worked? Has it, like, helped you with anxiety?
Having a relationship with God and helping with anxiety, depression, it's been very influential. So I'm like a holistic healing kind of person. It sounds like really new agey, but that's not what I mean. It is like mind, body, and soul. So for the mind, it's like I totally believe in medicine and treating the mind, and then body and that element. But the soul part is definitely the work of Jesus in my life. So I tried to commit suicide when I was 16 because that's where my depression led me. And it was through that moment of my attempted suicide that I realized like Jesus was real, and he wanted me, and that was a game changer for me. So now dealing with anxiety, depression, it's kind of like maybe you would handle this. This is a bad analogy, but we'll go with it. It's like handling a cold, you know? Like, do you go to like the throne of Jesus, like because you have a runny nose? And it's totally fine if you do. I don't. Maybe I should. And so it's something that I deal with. And if it wasn't for like the redemptive hand of God, I don't think I'd be able to see the beauty in my anxiety and depression. I wouldn't be able to see the story. So I think everything that we deal with, whether it's anxiety or depression or whatever it is, I think it's the only way to see the true scar of the story is through Jesus. I kind of said it in the last breakout that we're often afraid to like try to dig into our wounds. But if I can recall, Jesus has never left a wound unscarred. So Jesus is the author of those stories. So just as much as my anxiety and depression has played a part of my story, that's all been orchestrated through Jesus. If you're vulnerable and empathetic and another person is not willing to be vulnerable and empathetic back, I think that's kind of going off of your question earlier. That's a lot of trial and error. That I think that's a healthy decision and a wise decision for a person to kind of step away from that and say like, you know, I want my story to be impactful and I want you to hear it. but it's definitely like a connection. And if someone's like willing to stop that connection, is it really healthy? No. And so I wouldn't say like, hey, drop everyone out of your life if they're not vulnerable. But I'd be cautious. That's like the honesty part. Like, okay, someone's not willing to be empathetic and vulnerable. And so I'm going to be honest with them. And I'm going to share what I would share with any person. And I want to show them that love of my story. But what you choose to disclose information to is definitely trial and error, I guess.
What that process is like from your scar, like what's the self-reflection process of realizing I feel like I'm healed from this?
Like when the scar is healed. I know, like, so I had like surgeries. I've had 6 surgeries for my cleft. And so I think it's a time process. I said earlier, like, I don't know if in 10 years, so like I'm pretty settled with it at this point. I guess there's days that it's hard, but not really. But in 10 years, like what if I meet somebody who also had a cleft and a different story, and then my story's added to, and that scar is continued. So I think when you're moving from a place of like, okay, I've identified it, I think the healing process has already started. And then it's just a lifetime of saying this was a wound and now it's not because Jesus is good. And then like moving forward, I think scars are just kind of an ongoing process. And so it's like a collection basket of stories. So, yeah, if that was helpful.
So I recently had an individual ask what confided to me that they have been pet. And like I'm the first person that they have ever told. And so she told me, but I don't know what to do after that. Like what is the next step of helping her, or what can I do?
I think the number one thing you can do if somebody's dealing with anxiety or depression is to validate them and to validate the hurt, even if you don't understand it. And I think that's like kind of the first part of empathy, to say like, hey, I don't actually know exactly what you're going through right now, and I don't know if I'll ever understand it like in my own perspective, but what you're feeling is completely real, and it totally hurts, and I'm sorry that you have to go through it. And then consistency. They sound so little of things to do, but they're game changers for people. To say, hey, your hurt is real and I'm sticking with it. Which again, sounds like, oh, that's like nothing. But to somebody who is dealing with depression and like struggling with their worth or how they view themselves or loss of some sort, they need something consistent because they can't be consistent on their own. So even if it's just sitting in a coffee shop with them and like not trying to ask the questions and then they're just sitting in silence, I think that speaks more because it shows that you're willing to stick it out with them. So yeah, consistency, validation.
What passages in the Bible verses that God specifically spoken to you, like help encourage you or give you boldness to share your story, like just a way you would help someone who doesn't see that wound be able to
Yeah, there's a verse, Zephaniah 3:17. I don't know how to spell that, so I just abbreviate it. And that was one of the first verses I read after I tried to commit suicide at 16. And that verse, and the first song I heard after that time was that Mighty to Save song from however long ago that was. And I think they'll often use like Zephaniah 3:17 to kind of interlude to that song, because there's a line in there that says the Lord is singing over you. He is mighty to save. And for me, the fact that like Jesus took delight in me as a person was something that I needed to hear, because I had struggled with abandonment my whole life and feeling so unwanted by everybody, that knowing that like this creator of the universe, even if no one else wanted me, that he was singing over me, and that he sings over each one of us, and just how great of a relationship that is. So even though it's not directly specifically towards the story, I think finding delight in the fact that Jesus is madly in love with us was the courage to continue to incite that with other people.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.